Hello and welcome to another session of Hermeneutics. This is the monthly class that is encouraging people to interpret the Bible correctly based on the hermeneutical rules that are set out in standard hermeneutical textbooks. My name is Dustin Smith, and we have been slowly working through the basics of interpreting the scriptures based on the textbook we've been using. We could use a variety of textbooks, but we've been using this one right here. There's actually a third edition. This is technically the second edition, but the information is all the same. That's a pretty generally well-rounded book. I would say I probably agree with like 95% of what's in it. It's got a couple of conservative slants to it that I think are a little bit unnecessary, but hey, you do the best you can with what you have. So last time we talked about interpreting the genre of Old Testament law, primarily the literature that we find in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And so we're going to move this month to looking at Old Testament poetry. Now, we're just going to kind of do some introductory points on Old Testament poetry. We're going to have another session that's going to look at wisdom literature in particular. So this is not going to cover all of the books that you might consider to be the books of poetry within the Hebrew Bible, but this is going to look particularly at the poetry that does appear, and poetry appears in several places outside of those books of poetry. So this will help you to know where they are and to recognize them and to interpret them appropriately. Okay, so let's begin. All right. I think we are good to go on that. Okay, so we're talking about how to read Old Testament poetry, and we got a lot of stuff to get through in looking in this. So let's just kind of look at some of the basics before we dive in too deep. So while the Old Testament narrative is the most common literary form, and we've talked about this before, that narrative is 40% of the Old Testament and 31% of the entire Bible, poetry is the second most common. So it is extremely popular and it is all over the place. So nearly every biblical book has at least some form of poetry, making it the responsibility of the interpreter to expect poetry and to identify it. And this is a big deal because if you only think that you're going to find poetry in Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, then you're going to come across poetic passages in like Genesis and Deuteronomy and Samuel and Kings, and especially in the prophets. And you're not going to know it's poetry. And so you're going to be interpreting it literally instead of interpreting it as poetry. And you're not going to be able to make sense of what's actually being said there by the biblical authors. And so the best thing we could do is recognize that poetry is all over the place. And then we can actually come to expect it. We can be looking forward to it. And then we can take it seriously whenever we do find it. As I mentioned, it's not just in the Old Testament books of poetry. Now, many of the biblical books contain prayers and songs, and prayers and songs are going to be organized by the biblical authors in poetry. And so you're going to find prayers and songs, of course, in the book of Psalms, but you're also going to find it in a variety of other places, especially within Hebrew narrative. And so that's going to be really, really important. So take, for example, 1 Samuel chapter 2. Samuel, of course, is part of the Deuteronomistic history, and Samuel is primarily narrative, but 1 Samuel chapter 2 is the Song of Hannah, and it is extremely poetic, and it just jumps out of the page as to how poetic it actually is. But it's not in a standard book of poetry. So it's one of those things that we have to be looking forward to. And we just need to recognize that poetry is just one of the standard ways in which God communicates to his people. Again, it's the second most common literary form in the Old Testament. Okay, so we mentioned prayers and hymns, so let's just kind of start looking at prayers in particular. And in this manner, we'll be able to see a little bit about the poetic arrangement within these petitions to God. So within the Bible, poetic prayers are spoken by individuals or by groups. You might tend to think that prayers are really only spoken by a single person, but there are several times to where a family gets together, or the entire congregation gets together, or the children of Israel get together, and they offer forth a prayer to Yahweh. Now, one of the most common prayers is what is called a complaint prayer. This is a prayer where you are complaining to God. Again, we don't typically pray this way, but it's fairly common. And after reading through some of these, I've given you several examples within the Psalms where complaint prayers appear. So you can see not only that they do, in fact, exist, but also they are fairly widespread. Then maybe you will feel encouraged in your own prayer life to frame it in a way that is offering a complaint. So within the complaint prayer, there are going to be several different parts of it that make it discernible as a complaint prayer. It's not going to say in the subtitle, a complaint from David. It's not going to say that way. You're just going to have to read through it and look for the clues. And so this is a list of some of the clues that identify a particular poetic prayer as a complaint prayer. So it's going to begin with an invocation where you, the person offering the prayer, or the group of people that are offering the prayer, they're going to invoke the object of the prayer, which in this case is God. So Psalm 22 says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Far from my deliverance are the words of my groaning, O my God. I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I have no rest. Okay, first couple of verses of Psalm 22. And I know what a lot of people are thinking. A lot of people are thinking that Psalm 22 has been quoted heavily in the New Testament to describe Jesus, particularly in his suffering on the cross. There are several examples of this, particularly in Matthew and Mark. But I want us to kind of set that aside for now. And while that is a legitimate way in which the New Testament authors are using Psalm 22, we want to be able to interpret Psalm 22 in its original context. And what we're going to see here is that there is someone who actually is suffering and he's calling out to God, but his experience is that he continually calls out to God, but he's not getting any answer from God. And this is why it is a complaint. Okay, the next part of the complaint prayer is going to be an affirmation of confidence. So even though he is complaining, the fact that bad things are happening to him and God seems to be very far off, and the salvation and deliverance that he has been groaning for and longing for seems to be very, very far away, he is still confident in God's trustworthiness and God's commitment to his people. So in the next three verses, in verses 3 through 5, the psalmist says, yet you are holy, O you who are enthroned upon the praises of Israel. In you our fathers trusted. They trusted, and you delivered them. To you they cried out and were delivered. In you they trusted and were not disappointed. Okay, so you see, he's not complaining anymore. He's kind of shifted to say that, look, in the past, you've proven yourself to be faithful and loyal to your people. You have kept your covenant. You've kept your covenant love, your loving kindness. And he is using that to motivate him in the present. So he is affirming his confidence in the trustworthiness of God, who is able to save and deliver him. Okay. Then we get the massive part of the complaint. And by massive, I mean it actually goes from verses 6 through 16. And I couldn't even fit all of it onto one particular slide. But I want you to see in this complaint just the way that the psalmist pours his heart out to him. And in particular, I want you to take seriously the fact that the psalmist is going to employ some of the deepest and most poetic sort of language that we could come to expect. Okay. So starting in verse 6, he says, but I am a worm and not a man. That's pretty poetic. A reproach of men and despised by the people. The passage goes on. He says, many bulls have surrounded me. Strong bulls of Bashan have encircled me. They open wide their mouth at me at a Ravening and a roaring lion, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax, it is melted within me. My strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaves to my jaws. And you lay me in the dust of death, for dogs have surrounded me. A band of evildoers has encompassed me. They pierced my hands and my feet. Okay. So, first of all, he sees himself as like less than human. He's just a mere worm, kind of from the perspective of the reproach of men, he is despised. And then he describes his enemies in terms of these ferocious animals. I mean, it's not like they're actual bulls that are surrounding him or roaring lions or dogs. These are various ways of describing the ferociousness of his enemies. And you can see in the parallelism, especially in verses 15 through 16, where it says, "The dogs have surrounded me, a band of evildoers has encompassed me." So there, the dogs are further described as a band of evildoers. Okay. So clearly, there's a lot of poetry that's taking place here that if you were to read in a woodenly literal way, the passage wouldn't make any sense. The psalmist is not a worm. A worm is not surrounded by bulls and dogs and lions. Okay. His heart is not melting like wax. I mean, it's not literally melting in some sort of heat. Okay. This is the level of poetry that the writer can pour out with his prayer that he's offering. Let's continue looking at this passage. So in verse 19 through 21, we have the petition. This is where the psalmist is going to ask something of God. Now that he's gotten the complaint off his chest, now he's going to make an official declaration of asking God for salvation and deliverance. But you, O Yahweh, be not far off. O you, my help, hasten to my assistance. Deliver my soul from the sword, my only life from the power of the dog. Save me from the lion's mouth, from the horns of the wild oxen. You answer me. Okay. So again, we have the request. The request here is to not be far off, hasten to my assistance, to deliver me from the sword and from the power of the dog, to save me and to answer me. Just a variety of different ways of saying, help me out, please, help me out. And of course, we can see that the opponents are continually described in these heavily poetic descriptions. Okay. They are wild oxen, they are lions, they are dogs, and they're just also the sword. Okay. The sword, of course, is just a way of describing the person who is holding the sword. Okay. And you can see, by the way, as we're kind of thinking ahead to the New Testament, how Jesus could have been meditating on a passage like this and knowing that God eventually did deliver the psalmist, which is why the passage actually was written down and it's survived to us to this day. And he would, of course, pray out the first verse, the my God, why have you forsaken me? Okay. The last part of the complaint prayer is the thanksgiving, and it's often portrayed in an actual hymn, as in a song. And so in verses 22 through 26, that's the entirety of Thanksgiving. I'm not going to put all of it here, but it says, I will tell of your name to my brethren. In the midst of the assembly, I will praise you. You who fear Yahweh, praise him. All you descendants of Jacob, glorify him and stand in awe of him, all you descendants of Israel. For he has not despised nor abhorred the affliction of the afflicted, nor has he hidden his face from him. But when he cried to him for help, he heard. And by God hearing, that means that God actually answered that particular petition. So the sense at the very, very end is that the complaint has actually worked. The petition has actually been answered. And now he's riding from a new perspective, a safe perspective. He's not being surrounded by enemies. His life is not on the brink of death. He has been restored. And now he is calling on the people around him to worship. And he is doing this, of course, in the assembly. So these are complaint prayers, uh, fairly often appearing in the book of Psalms. And you can see that you're going to find this sort of way of dividing out these particular complaint prayers. And we looked in the previous slide where I gave you like a dozen examples of complaint prayers. You can go through and you can kind of, just kind of in your own Bible, make some marginal notes and kind of break it down now that you understand how it is composed. You can understand the parts of the whole. Okay, let's talk about imprecatory prayers or imprecatory psalms, excuse me. Okay, so these psalms, and again, I'm giving you a variety of examples there, about a dozen. These poetically invoke judgment, calamity, or curses upon the wicked. Again, these are the sort of psalms that we don't typically read about in church. They're probably not the psalms that you have stitched on a pillow in your living room. They're not the ones that you have put up on your refrigerator as kind of your verse that's going to inspire you throughout the day. But they are there in the scriptures, and we want to understand the poetry that's behind them, and of course, how to interpret them appropriately. So the poetry in these imprecatory psalms are extremely exaggerated and they're hyperbolic. And they function as a way to attempt to persuade God to intervene. And they do so by telling us how the psalmist really feels. Okay. So we got to get some interesting examples of these imprecatory psalms. So in Psalm 10, verse 15, the psalmist prays to God and he says, "Break the arm of the wicked and the evildoer, seek out his wickedness until you find none." Okay. Again, this is not the sort of thing that you think that we should be praying these days, but this is the sort of language that's there. It shows that the psalmist has been deeply hurt, and these are things that he is, hyperbolically and from an exaggerated standpoint, asking God for his judgment to be poured out on his enemies. Okay, let's look at some other examples. Psalm 109, verses 8 through 16. Let his days be few, let another take his office, let his children be fatherless, and his wife a widow. Okay. By the way, just kind of remind you, some of you probably have already picked up on this point. This is the psalm that's actually quoted at the beginning of the book of Acts to describe how the apostles are going to replace Judas with the next apostle. And here it says to let another take his office. But the things that are actually said about Judas are uh, they're harsh. They're kind of harsh. Now, they don't quote the entirety of this psalm in the beginning of the book of Acts. I think it's Acts chapter 1. And you could see why. So in regard to this evildoer, again, let his children be fatherless and his wife become a widow. Let his children wander about and beg. Let them seek sustenance far from their ruined homes. Let a creditor seize all that he has, and let strangers plunder the product of his labor. Let there be none to extend loving kindness to him, nor any to be gracious to his fatherless children. Let his posterity be cut off, and a following generation let their name be blotted out. Let the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before Yahweh, and do not let the sin of his mother be blotted out. Let them be before Yahweh continually, that he may cut off their memory from the earth. Because, and we kind of now see why all these terrible, awful things are being said about this particular person. Because he did not remember to show loving kindness, but he persecuted the afflicted and needy man and the despondent in heart and put him to death. And so you can see how the early Christians would look at this and draw upon it and say, yeah, this seems like it's applying to Judas. Judas is the one that persecuted the afflicted and the needy man, namely Jesus, and contributed to putting him to death. Okay. But man, there's a lot of terrible things that are said, not just about the wicked person, but about his entire family and his wife and his children. But this is the function of these imprecatory psalms. They're meant to be over the top, and the poetry that's used there is written in hyperbole, not so that we take it literally and take it at face value, but so that we see how much this person is hurting and we can try to understand how he is getting it off his chest by just lashing out at God with his words. And he does so with some pretty powerful poetry. Okay, let's move to the next example. Okay, so these are going to be the Thanksgiving songs and psalms. Okay, so a much lighter note than what we saw in the previous slide. Excuse me. All right. So Thanksgiving songs record the gratitude of an individual or the community on behalf of God delivering them from a previous time of misery. Okay. So several examples here. Again, I'm giving you what, like 15, between 15 and 20 examples. This is fairly common within the book of Psalms. Okay. So the psalmist or a group of people, community, are expressing their gratitude because God has delivered them at some particular time in the past. That's especially what it is. Okay. It's not just, hey, I'm thankful because I have food on my table today, or I'm thankful that I have a roof over my head. Those things are fine. It's okay to pray for those things, but these particular ones are being thankful because God has delivered them from a perilous moment in the past. Okay. So these we can actually break down into several points, like we've seen in the past. So the first part of these Thanksgiving Psalms, and we'll just take Psalm 30 as an example. We have the praise of Yahweh. I will extol you, O Yahweh. Why? Purpose statement. For you have lifted me up and have not let my enemies rejoice over me. Okay. So this person has been exalted out of his dire straits, and the enemies do not have an opportunity to rejoice over him. And so, because of this, the writer is extolling Yahweh. Okay. And then the next part of it is the invitation for the others to join in on the praise. Okay. So we see this in verses 4-5. Sing praise to Yahweh. Okay. This command here, sing praise, is second person plural, as in like you all need to be singing praise to Yahweh. So it's not talking to you, the reader, although it's okay for you, the reader, to take this seriously. He's inviting others, several others, to participate in this worship. Okay. Sing praises to Yahweh, you his godly ones, and give thanks to his holy name. Why? Here's another purpose statement. For his anger is but for a moment, his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may last for the night, but a shout of joy comes in the morning. Okay. So, yeah, difficult times for a little bit. Okay. Anger is for a short moment, weeping is for a small night. Okay. But his favor is for a lifetime, and the shout of joy comes in the morning. Okay. So there's the invitation for others to participate. Okay. Now, we actually get the reason as to why Yahweh deserves this particular piece of Thanksgiving. And this is going to be the biggest section within the Thanksgiving Psalms. Okay. And so here in Psalm 30, it's in verses 7-12. Okay. So, O Yahweh, by your favor, you have made my mountain to stand strong. Okay. Look at the poetry that's there. You hid your face. I was dismayed. To you, O Yahweh, I called, and to the Lord I made supplication. What profit is there in my blood if I go down to the pit? Will the dust praise you? Will it declare your faithfulness? That's a rhetorical question because the answer to that is no. Those that go down to the dust cannot declare God's faithfulness because they're dead, they're unconscious, and they are sleeping. Okay, so then we have the call, hear, O Yahweh, and be gracious to me, O Yahweh, be my helper. You have turned for me my mourning into dancing. You have loosened my sackcloth and girded me with gladness. This is the sackcloth of mourning. Why? Purpose statement. That my soul may sing praise to you and not be silent. O Lord my God, probably O Yahweh my God, I will give thanks to you forever. Okay, just like an ongoing, continually a persistent level of praise. Okay. So he had a difficult time. Okay. Um, God had hid his face from the psalmist and he was dismayed. He called out and he's like, look, what benefit is it if I go down to the pit, if I go down to the dust? Can I praise you there? Anyone praise you there? Can anyone declare your faithfulness? If you want me to continue praising you, you got to rescue me. And of course, Yahweh responded to that. Okay. He was gracious. He helped him. And he, of course, gives all of these reasons as to why the second section of the Thanksgiving Psalm should be taken seriously, which is the invitation for others to join in on the praise. And it's just kind of a nice, neat little package. Okay. All right. Let's look here at love songs. Love songs. Okay. They do appear in the books of poetry. You might be thinking of the book of Ecclesiastes. And I do want to make this particular point about Ecclesiastes. A lot of readers have read through Ecclesiastes. Excuse me, I didn't mean Ecclesiastes. I meant Song of Solomon. Sorry. Love songs and Song of Solomon. Okay. Which is literally like the Song of Songs. Like it's a kind of a way in Hebrew to say like the best song. And people have kind of struggled with the erotic imagery that actually appears in Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. And they've said, well, there's no way that this could be intended for the reader. So we've got to find some other way to interpret it. Like, certainly God would never allow this sort of love language, this love song, this erotic sort of vocabulary to be used. So we've got to find some other, there's got to be another way to interpret it. And so people have kind of reacted against reading it at face value. And they said, okay, well, maybe this is just a love song between God and Israel, or between God and his people, whether that's the Old Testament people or the New Testament people, or some sort of combination. Or maybe it's Christ and the church, or maybe it's involving Mary in some sense. But all of those have just been reactions from people that said, we can't just sit there and take the text at face value. And they try to find ways to kind of spin it away from that. But the reality is, it should be taken there at face value. It is an erotic collection of love songs between the king and his wife. And that's how it was intended. And I know it bothers a lot of people. And that's probably why it's not preached very often, which is fine. That's okay. Um, but we should resist the urge to say, well, it can't mean what I think it means, and let's just find some other way to interpret it. So, okay. So love songs are celebrated often at weddings. Okay. So like Psalm 45, which is a really, really important one. We'll look at this here in a second. Psalm 45 was probably read at a variety of weddings involving the Davidic king. So we're thinking of someone like Solomon, who had a variety of wives, or maybe Hezekiah, maybe Josiah, because it deals with the psalmist getting married, and it addresses the groom. It also addresses the bride. Okay. There's also a love song and a couple verses there in Ruth, chapter 1, verses 16 through 17, and also a couple verses there in Hosea. So you get there in the prophets as well. Okay, so let's look a little bit at Psalm 45 and let's kind of get a sense at the poetry that's used in these love songs. Okay, so this particular love song is written by the psalmist to the groom. Okay, and actually tells you it's a song of love. I mean, that's right there in the Hebrew. Okay, it's a song of love. Okay, my heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. Okay. This is not Yahweh the king. Okay. This is the human Israelite Davidic king. Okay. So there are songs sung to human beings in the Bible. Okay. Inspired songs. Psalm 45 is the best example. Okay. So this is to a king that's getting married. So this is not Yahweh the king. This is the human king. and songs can be sung to human beings. Okay. It's not considered to be blasphemous, not considered to take worship that's due to God and taking it away from him and giving it to someone else. No, this is just an appropriate way of honoring God's royal representative, which is what the Israelite king was functioning as within his purpose. Okay, so I will address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You, O king, are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured out upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Okay, notice this king obviously is not the true God. Okay, gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty, and in your majesty ride on victoriously. For the cause of truth and meekness and righteousness, let your right hand teach you awesome things. Okay. So a lot of poetry that's taking place here. Clearly, this is a king, and he's a pretty powerful king. He's the mighty one. He shares in God's splendor and God's majesty. Uh, he's someone that has been blessed by God, perpetually. Okay. All right. Um, Now, it also shifts to addressing the bride in verses 10 through 12. Okay, so the opening part is going to address the groom, and we could read more of that if we wanted to, especially verses 5, 6, and 7, which are really important Christologically, but they're not so important right now for interpreting the love song. So later in the psalm, it's going to shift and talk to the bride. And it tells you this: listen, O daughter. Okay, give attention and incline your ear. Forget your people and your father's house. Then the king will desire your beauty because he is your Lord. Bow down to him. Okay. The daughter of Tyre will come with a gift. The rich among the people will seek your favor. Okay. So the psalm is now shifting to talk to the bride. And of course, you see that she's supposed to, leave her father's country and to unite herself with this king. And the king in this patriarchal society, and of course, the fact that he is the king, he is the master of the bride, and she is to honor him and to respect him. Okay. This is probably why he's not preached very often today. Okay. But you get the sense here, like how exalted this human king actually is. Look at the sort of language that's actually given to him. Okay. But it's important to see in this song how the people being addressed are being changed. It starts by addressing the groom and then addresses the bride. Okay. We already mentioned this a little bit, but the Song of Songs is actually the Bible's best known love song. It's very rarely read, but I would say out of the love songs, Song of Songs is an entire book that's dedicated to it. It actually contains several different sections that would also be used at weddings, particularly, for example, Song of Solomon 3, verses 6 through 11. Okay. All right. So this book of poetry is to be read as an anthology of common themes and different speakers. It's not a narrative with a developing plot. So that's just kind of a real quick tip on reading Song of Songs as Old Testament poetry. It's not like a book like Genesis where you have, a protagonist and an antagonist, and you have a plot and you have drama and that sort of stuff there. It's read kind of back and forth, and the best thing you could do is to really keep track of who is actually speaking and who is being spoken to, whether it is God or whether it's the groom or the bride. It's going to be mostly the groom and the bride speaking and being spoken to within it. And if you don't have good study Bible notes that indicate that, it's really important to read it very slowly and carefully. And you can, of course, um, make little notes in your Bible that, the man's talking, the woman's talking, or you could say the groom is talking and the bride is talking. Okay. So that's my quick spiel on Song of Solomon. Okay. All right. So let's talk about principles for interpreting poetry. Okay. So what are some tips to help us to interpret Old Testament poetry responsibly, taking seriously the poetry, and recognizing its value for the readers. Okay, so number one, poems were written and they were intended to be read as complete units. They were not isolated into individual verses interpreted out of their larger context. Okay. Why is this a particular tip? Well, because it's far too often for us to just grab a couple of verses out of Psalms and to read it and to try to make sense of it, but they were never intended to be read that way. The individual verses of the Psalms, whether it's in the book of Psalms or whether it's a hymn that's in like First Samuel or something like Hosea or something like Ruth or even in Song of Songs. They were never intended to be little verses that are just kind of pulled out of context and just read without the larger context. So they were written as complete units. They were intended by their author to be read as complete units. And so we're going to have to do a little bit more work if we want to understand these passages, meaning we have to read the entire section and we have to kind of keep all of that in our mind as we're trying to make sense of the little parts. Okay. So I know this takes a little bit more time, takes a little bit more work, and it's going to kind of go against the grain of you wanting to turn and just grab a couple of verses here and there for some sort of inspiration. That's fine for a very quick sort of reading of scripture. But if we want to do close readings and critical readings and to interpret the Bible carefully, we have to understand that these little verses are part of a much wider uh, unit. And so we have to read that entire unit as a whole. So it's like we saw with those examples in the Psalms, where we have the Thanksgiving Psalms, to where the reason why people need to participate in the Thanksgiving only makes sense in light of the section that came before and the section that's going to follow it. Okay. So it's best to read an entire psalm all as one unit. And preferably you can read it out loud. It actually helps you to think about the material because you're reading it, you're looking at it, you're thinking about it as you're speaking it. Okay. Tip number two, we should interpret a psalm in light of other examples of its literary form. Okay. Whether it be a complaint psalm, an imprecatory psalm, a psalm of thanksgiving, the love songs, etc. Okay. So this is why it's important for us to go through and to understand the different types of poetry that appear in these psalms. And I didn't give you all of them. I just gave you the biggest ones, the ones that are the most frequent. And you saw they had, a dozen, 15, 20 examples each, to where you can kind of compare them with the other ones. You can get an idea as to how you should actually read and interpret them. Okay. So this is really important. So let's just kind of look at the complaint psalms. Okay. Yeah. So the psalmist is going to complain. Okay. So how do we interpret that? How do we take that seriously? Does it mean that we just have the right to constantly complain ourselves? Or is this person writing in a common literary form, in a common way in which these psalms were put together for the author, legitimately has a reason to complain, and he's going to tell God about it. And once he gets it off his chest, then he's going to be fine. But the best way to interpret and to understand that is to look at other complaint psalms and to understand the sort of literature that's there, how those authors are expressing their frustration to God, and we can interpret it in light of the context of that particular type of psalm. This is most important with the imprecatory psalms, to where the author is saying, may the children have their heads bashed on the rocks there in Babylon, in Psalm 130, I think it's 139 verse 7 or something like that, or 137 verse 9, one of those. And again, these are just the horrible things that are said when the psalmist is just extremely hurt. But we have to understand that this is the type of literature of those imprecatory psalms, to where they are using hyperbole to the strongest sense that the poet possibly could use. Okay. They are exaggerating their language. And when you deliberately exaggerate something and people know that you're exaggerating, there's not going to be any confusion as to what you're trying to say. And of course, what you mean by that exaggeration. It only becomes a problem when you start to exaggerate something and someone takes you at face value and they interpret you in a way that goes far beyond the way that you had intended. Yes, the psalmist is very unhappy. He is deeply hurt and he wants vengeance upon his enemies. Okay. But usually by the end of the psalm, it kind of calms down a little bit. Okay. And it's important for us to recognize that type of literature. And the best way to do it is to read other examples of that type of literature, to see the sort of exaggerated, hyperbolic language and poetry that's being used, to recognize it, to know that you're not supposed to interpret that at face value. And thereby we won't have so many problems and people won't start to feel so upset about that. Okay. And I think once you grasp that, then maybe you could feel led to pray those particular psalms if you feel like it fits your particular situation. Okay. So that's something to consider. And the Thanksgiving songs, I think they're probably the easiest of the bunch to understand and to appreciate. So again, you have the Thanksgiving that's offered, you have the call for others to participate, and you have why you are offering things. And again, it's not just that I'm thankful because I have so many good things in my life. That's okay and that's fine. And that should be handed over to God and offered in things. These Thanksgiving songs are given because God has delivered the speaker or speakers at some point in the past, and it's going to be mentioned within the particular psalm. Okay, so that motivates the Thanksgiving, but also helps us to situate this type of literature in light of the other examples within these Psalms. And then we talk about the love songs. Again, Psalm 45, one of the best examples. Song of Solomon, probably the biggest example because it's an entire book with collection of various love songs. And the best way to, again, interpret those is to just read a bunch of them so you get a feel for it, you get a flavor for it. Okay. Number three, we should seek to recover the original setting of the psalm and take note of the speakers. Is the speaker saying, I am doing this, or we are doing it, or you are doing this, etc. That way you can tell, by the way, if the speaker is just one person, okay, the original psalmist, or if it's a collection of people, a group of people, like a congregation. And in doing so, as in by recovering the setting of the psalm and noticing who actually is speaking it, we need to not read too much into the psalm's dedication. Okay, what is the dedication? That's the part at the very, very beginning before you actually read verse one. It's usually kind of up there in italics. And the dedication is actually there in the Hebrew. It actually is there, and so it gets translated. But something that most English readers are unaware of is the flexibility and the ambiguity with one of the most common dedications on the Psalms, which typically reads as a Psalm of David. Okay. The Psalm of David gives you the impression that David is the author of this particular psalm. However, the Hebrew preposition that is used for this phrase, Psalm of David, the preposition basically means to or for, meaning a psalm to David or a psalm for David, suggesting that the Davidic psalms are not actually written by him, a psalm of David, as in I, David, am the author of this particular psalm, but rather these are psalms that are written in David's honor. They're written to him, they're written for him, they're written in honor of his memory or in honor of something that David did in his own lifetime. So we shouldn't assume that David actually wrote all of these things uh, based strictly on the setting. He may have, but he may not have. And so I'll give you an example. Psalm 23, Lord is my shepherd. Okay, this is a psalm of David. But the last verse says something that David could not possibly have said. Okay. It says, surely goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord for length of days, usually translated as forever. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Okay. So the house of the Lord is a reference to the temple. There was no temple when David was alive. It wasn't even built until after David died and Solomon started to build it. So this is not the sort of thing that David himself could have said, okay? But it's written in David's honor because David was known to be a shepherd king, okay? So when we're trying to understand the original setting of these Psalms, you want to take notice of those particular points. Is it talking about a temple? Okay. Is it talking about the temple that used to be there and now it's gone? Is it talking about a people that are in exile? Is it talking about a wedding? Okay. Is it one person that's talking? Is it multiple persons that are talking? And don't just quickly latch on to the dedication, a Psalm of David, a Psalm of Moses, because that preposition there, the primary meaning of it, the preposition la in Hebrew, Psalm la David, is meaning two or four, usually meaning in David's honor. Okay. All right. Number four, instead of reading poetry literally first and then figuratively second, like so many people, for whatever reason, have been taught to do, but it is 100% false, poetry should be engaged intentionally and carefully. Again, we need to recognize that poetry is going to appear outside of Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and a Song of Songs. It's going to appear in nearly every single book of the Old Testament. We should know that, we should expect it, and we should anticipate it. And when it does show up, you don't read poetry literally. The psalmist is not a worm. He's not surrounded by bulls and lions and dogs. Okay? We have to take the poetry seriously, but to take it seriously does not mean to take it literally. And of course, the more that we read Old Testament poetry, the easier it's going to be to discern how the poet is waxing poetically and using his language. One last point. Okay. The royal psalms that express poetic hope for the anointed king should be read typologically, not prophetically. We didn't take the time to go into this in much detail at all, but the royal psalms are the psalms that talk about God's anointed. Okay. So, like Psalm 2, Psalm 72, Psalm 89, Psalm 110, Psalm 132. Okay. They talk about Yahweh and his anointed. Okay. The anointed in Hebrew is Mashiach. Okay. And the New Testament, we know of a particular figure called the Messiah. Okay. But these royal psalms originally were psalms that were talking about the anointed king at that particular time, whether that person be, again, David, Solomon, Hezekiah, Josiah, one of these positive kings, positive royal figures. And even though they have a lot to say about the ultimate anticipated ideal reign of this messianic figure, these are not meant to be read prophetically in the sense that they are predicting things. They are meant to be read typologically because Psalms are not prophetic literature. Okay. When the New Testament authors used them, they interpreted them typologically, not as fulfillments of predictive prophecy. Okay. Prophecy is going to appear later. Prophecy is going to be Isaiah, Jeremiah, the book of the 12, that sort of thing. Okay. So it's a subtle point there. It is taking seriously the fact that the New Testament authors are reading these and ultimately finding their fulfillment in Jesus, who is the Messiah, the Christ. Okay. But they weren't interpreting them prophetically per se. They were interpreting them typologically. So, okay. Hopefully that has helped you to understand Old Testament poetic literature and helped you to recognize and appreciate the poetry that actually is there, so that we can interpret the Bible more responsibly. Thank you so much for watching. Take care. We'll see you next month, and wish you luck in your endeavors of reading and interpreting the Bible. Take care.